Now I want to talk a little bit about personal medicine. And by medicine, I don't mean medicine in the European sense of, penicillin or ibuprofen, or really even not even talking about herbs or various other things meant to heal an ailment. That is medicine, but in the sense it's usually used in native culture, medicine is another word meaning your personal spiritual power. And this can be both something that you carry within by the degree of spirituality and the degree of connection that you have with the spirit world. But also, it can designate specific items that a person would carry with them to sort of augment that spirituality. Uh, Things that would be described as having good medicine, or having strong medicine, or maybe having bad medicine. Spirituality, and in many cultures, including on the plains, an individual would literally carry these things with them, usually in a small pouch called a medicine pouch or a medicine bag that often would be, and sometimes still is, worn around the neck, like in this picture. Though usually it would be under the clothing. The items that you would have inside a medicine bag might be things that are considered sacred by your particular group. And there are certain herbs that were almost universally considered sacred, like tobacco, and sage, sweetgrass, and some other things. So you might have things like that in there. You might have individual items that have a special significance to you, that are connected somehow to an action, or to an event, or to a time that you felt would have a sort of this special power, and it would go into. It's also called a medicine bundle. The things that go in that bag, and in almost every culture, this was deeply, deeply personal, and the contents were not shared or even spoken of. This was something deeply personal and usually secret. So here is another image of such a bag. It's kind of similar to, if you're familiar with hoodoo, traditional folk magic, voodoo type stuff, mojo. Mojo is a different type of charm, and a mojo bag. That's something that comes ultimately from African tradition. That's very similar. So talismans of personal power. Now, while we're talking about medicine, let's talk about the term medicine man. On the surface, that sounds almost like it would be an irreverent term to use. So sometimes people say shaman instead. Now, the problem with that is that shaman is a very specific type of thing, and the word shaman comes from actually from Siberia, from Siberian tribes, which is interesting, the degree of similarity that exists there, considering that if you go back many thousands of years, there was a common culture. But even today, within tribal communities, the term medicine man is used freely and frequently, and so really there's nothing wrong with using that. Witch doctor would be a bad thing to say, an inappropriate thing. But a medicine man really is someone who deals in the spiritual, maybe even as much or more than in physical healing. So a medicine man sort of like does all those things all those things together. So shaman kind of can fit, but again, it's not really culturally specific to Native Americans. Um, a better term is ritual specialist, but that doesn't roll off the tongue that well, does it? Priest is not really the right term because uh, a priest in any religion and in any spiritual tradition, a priest is a member of a specific class that is often um, part of part of this class that goes through a specific, very specific training period. It carries out do carry out rituals, um, and that kind of applies because a medicine man has to be trained usually by another medicine man or woman. Um, but if you're talking about a priesthood, that implies sort of uniformity. That implies that everyone does things a certain prescribed way. And medicine men or medicine women can vary in their approaches and how they do things. So that's the preferred term. Now, some related things pertaining to ritual that you see a lot in Native culture is smudging, particularly among the Plains tribes. But this is something that most tribes practice to some degree in some way. So here you see some of those sacred items that I mentioned. Also, cedar is considered sacred because it's an evergreen. And smudging is when you take one of these items that is especially spiritual, like sage or tobacco, usually sage, or sweetgrass, and you burn it. And here there is an abalone shell that's used to burn it in, and then as the smoke comes up from this burning herb or plant, you use a feather or a feather fan or almost like a wing that this individual is using, but at the very least, a single feather that you waft the smoke over yourself, or you could just use your hands, but you sort of direct the smoke over yourself, and you're being purified by that smoke as it's covering you over your head and your arms and so forth. And that is another way, sort of like we talked about sweat lodges. That's a purification ceremony, something that one does either for the sake of just doing it for purification or in preparation for another ritual. In various rituals and ceremonies that were conducted, and many still are conducted, you also have musical accompaniment, but particularly the drum. Drums are sacred to Native people, and in many Native people, if you talk to them about the significance of drums, will tell you that the drum is the heartbeat of Mother Earth. So a couple of other cultural things that I wanted to talk about include well, the teepee. Now this is something that is used in the plains, was used in the plains, north and south. Its use outside of the Great Plains area was limited. There were a lot of different types of structures that Native peoples lived in, sometimes referred to as wigwams, for instance, which I think came from an Algonquin word introduced to colonial settlers in the East. But usually you had people living in permanent or semi-permanent abodes, buildings, like a wickiup is another word, hogan in the Southwest. Often something that was made of sticks, wattle, and daub in the East, where you take mud and thatch and so forth. Teepee is different. You all know what a teepee is, which comes from the Lakota, by the way, the word. Or lodge would be another way to put it. But the teepee is specifically something that was in use culturally by the Plains Indians because it's a portable place of dwelling. It's easy to take down and move and put back up because essentially you've got a series of poles and then you cover it with buffalo hides. And as you can see here, there are ways that you can have like flaps in the top to let out the smoke of your fire. And some of these things could be big and actually could accommodate several people. Now, a problem arises when, because of pop culture, most Americans just assume all native peoples lived in teepees, or sometimes assume they still do. And this was a plains tribe thing. Okay, another cultural aspect of native people across North and South America is the extreme importance of storytelling, because there was no system of writing, particularly in North America. Pictographs, in the sense of, like, we looked at that spiral series of pictures that was on that one individual's teepee door. But so far as a written language, traditionally there had been no such thing. So oral tradition is how things were passed down. They were passed down by stories, and this is something that's true in cultures all around the world, particularly pre-writing cultures. People can transmit generationally very elaborate stories, sometimes very, very long ones that are, memorized. That still might be almost like a living story because, the different tellers each imprint their own personality on it, but remaining remarkably similar down through the generations. So still today, you can go to Native American storytelling festivals when there are stories that are just tales about life, but oftentimes stories that, the word that people have always used about these types of stories, no matter where they're from, is mythology. But remember, I don't like that word. Stories that reflect the cosmology of the culture and the cosmogony of the culture, like how the universe came to be. Among native peoples in the Americas, there are some story elements that kind of carry over from culture to culture. Maybe not universally, but sometimes there's a lot of different cultures that have particular types of stories. Like, for example, the story of a great big hairy creature that lives in the woods. You find stories like that throughout North America under different names. Creation stories, kind of, they're unique to each tribe or linguistic group. But there again are some common themes that run through there. One common theme is that once upon a time the whole world was covered with water, and a lot of origin stories tell about which brave animal it might have been that first dove under the water and brought back up some mud that turned into land. And among the Algonquin language group, which, again, you'll recall that was a really large area in the northern half of North America. A common thing is the turtle. Um, Whether you're talking about the Ojibwe or the Cree or Algonquin-speaking tribes much farther to the east, that brave animal was a turtle in those stories, and turtles are considered to be sacred by many groups. I encourage you to do some a little bit of research on your own. You can go to YouTube and find storytelling competitions and listen to some of these native stories. It's really a wonderful experience. Now, the last part of our discussion about culture, before we move to the historical narrative, is I want to talk about the culture of leadership and the culture of warfare among Native people generally, and specifically also on the Great Plains. Now, this is something that was misunderstood greatly by Euro-American colonists, and is still misunderstood by the general public in the United States. And that is what makes a leader, how's a leader chosen? The fact is that a lot of pop culture stuff, old Western movies and books and stories, and just sort of transmitted oral history among non-native people, is this idea that Indian chiefs, that is a hereditary title, like the son of a chief becomes the chief, or the term Indian princess, meaning the daughter of a chief, except for a small group of people in a specific region. You didn't have stuff like that in North America. Now, at one time, you'd had more of it. Remember, we talked about the DeSoto expedition into the American South and how the cultures, the Mississippian culture was very hierarchical. Many of those Mississippian cultures did have hereditary leadership and perhaps even very strictly defined social classes, and in essence like a nobility. You had that in Central America and in South America. But that Mississippi shatter zone that we talked about, where the just huge numbers of people who died of disease after contact with the Europeans caused those cultures to collapse and then reconstitute themselves at a more fundamental and more egalitarian and communal level. The exceptions, and we talked about this before when we looked at that map of the DeSoto expedition, the exceptions are some tribes in the Gulf Coast area in Louisiana and maybe a little bit into Arkansas and East Texas, the Natchez or Natchez tribe, and the various Caddoan tribes, particularly the farther east that you went. They still perhaps had some of these hereditary leadership positions. Also, the Pacific Northwest, some of those cultures were a lot more hierarchical and class-oriented, but that's a very small percentage of the native peoples of North America. And that's not how it worked, probably in 95% of tribes. And it's not how it worked in any of the tribes on the Great Plains, except, again, maybe for some of those Caddoan tribes down in the eastern part of Texas, bordering the plains. What usually happened instead is that tribal leaders or chiefs were they were chosen by the people. Someone who had a good track record of various qualities considered to be important. First and foremost being good medicine, spirituality, evidence of a good understanding of and connection with the spirit world, wisdom, making good decisions, Also, physical abilities like hunting and warfare. I mean, if someone shows themselves to be a really good tactician or a strategist, then obviously they might inspire the confidence of their fellows. And something that pop culture leaves out a lot, doesn't quite get, oratory skill, the ability to talk and talk well. And that's because, unlike the European leadership scheme, where you had a superior who was a superior usually because they had property or money, and then all their subordinates had to do what they said or they would be direly punished. It didn't work that way in Native culture. The leader didn't really have the authority to coerce anyone into doing anything. They had to have the ability to convince people to do things. And there was an enormous amount of individual freedom, which is kind of a paradox. Among native cultures, you've got their tribal cultures, they're very community oriented, they're very oriented toward the greater good, the good of the community. But at the same time, within that community, there's an enormous amount of latitude for individuality and making one's own decisions. So you can't force anyone to follow you. You can't force anyone to obey orders. You have to be the sort of person that is able to convince people. And what happens then, you might ask, if someone is just a habitual sort of renegade kind of, well, renegade would be a bad word in this instance, a maverick that never listens to anybody? Well, social pressure would be put on that person, peer pressure, really. So if you're the sort of person, you're a warrior, and you're the sort of person that never follows the plan, never listens to anybody, always does things your own way, odds are you're going to mess things up a lot for everybody else. And they're going to maybe shun you, or even worse, make fun of you. They will just cause you great shame, loss of honor, either through the shunning or through the ridicule and sarcasm, which, because these are very honor-based cultures, an individual would just absolutely hate for their peers to treat them that way, so they'd be more likely to fall in line. But that's the way you would do it. And that, actually, since we're talking about cultural stuff, that's how children were raised as well. Native people traditionally, it's hard to find a culture among the indigenous peoples of North America where children were beaten or spanked. Children were kept in line, kind of along these same ways, by social pressure. So that's what makes a leader. Now, if a person attains leadership, and then another thing is, again, how much stuff they give away, which means how much do they contribute to the community. If a person becomes a leader and then they make a series of bad decisions, people will just stop following them and choose someone else to be their leader. Oftentimes, in native culture, particularly in the 18th, 19th century, you had these sort of tandem leaders in which you would have one person that was a great spiritual leader paired with a person who was a great military leader. And in that case, the spiritual leader was more highly regarded. Examples include back in the Great Lakes region in 1763, the leader named Pontiac, who was, Pontiac's rebellion which is not really the Pontiac War would be a better way to phrase that, but history books call it the Pontiac Rebellion, implying that the Indians didn't have the right to rise up. But Pontiac was one of the leaders of this a big movement in the Great Lakes to fight back against the English colonists. But there was also a person, Neolin, who was Delaware, the Delaware Prophet, and his spiritual movement that he started was sort of translated into a military movement by Pontiac and others. Another example in the 1810s, Tecumseh, also in the Great Lakes region, the great Shawnee military leader, his brother Tenskwatawa, who was also known as the Prophet, or the Shawnee Prophet, was the spiritual leader. And on the Great Plains, the same sort of thing could happen. We'll be talking a lot about these two people, Tatanka Iotake and Tashunka Witko, or Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, who were two Lakota leaders from different bands. But Sitting Bull was more of a spiritual leader, whereas Crazy Horse was the great military leader. And you may have heard of both of them, and you may not have known before this course that Sitting Bull was primarily a spiritual leader, because Europeans and later Americans, in their recounting from the time period of what was happening with these tribes, and the history books often written later, give very short shrift to the spiritual leaders. They kind of regard them as quote-unquote witch doctor types who kind of scammed the people, which is not true at all. Not true at all. But the Euro-American tradition then puts great emphasis on how great the military leaders were. But among native people, it was the spiritual leaders that would more often than not inspire them, and had a little more, maybe even social clout than the military leaders. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about warfare on the plains. And first, we will look at warfare before European contact and before the horse, because obviously the mastery of the horse is going to change a whole lot. Well, before there were horses, in the woodland period, particularly the late woodland period, from around the years 250 to 900, there is evidence of occasional violence. And particularly, I mentioned in one of the earlier lectures that once the bow and arrow were invented near the end of that period, you saw more violence. It was easier to kill people from a distance. The violence began to intensify in the 13th century, around 1250, after farms had become well established along the eastern part of the Great Plains, especially along the Missouri River, which is where the violence was probably the worst. Up there in the Dakotas, and the villages during that time started to have fences, palisades built around them, and moats and stuff. We talked about that, like when we discussed what happened at Crow Creek. So why did it intensify? Well, farms began to be established, so there's more things to fight over. There's a specific place to go and raid people. But also, this was around the time that series of great droughts occurred, which greatly intensified the likelihood of violence. It's been sort of cyclical throughout prehistory. When there is a time of plenty, you're more likely to have trade. But when when climate changes, or when other factors, physical factors arise, then people become more competitive, and that more easily translates into violence. Now, by about the year 1500, even though there were no horses yet, there were some nomadic groups living on the plains, again, using that age-old method of catching buffalo, stampeding them over cliffs or into canyons. And some of these nomadic groups had started to raid the agricultural villages along the rivers. But after the Europeans showed up, the violence was ratcheted up, well, you know, dialed up to an 11, you might say, because when the Europeans arrived and they brought with them their trade in furs, beaver pelts, deer skins, eventually in some areas trade in captives, buying captives from the Indians to use as slaves. And that trade introduced trade goods that the Indians could not manufacture themselves, which seemed like luxuries at first, but then come to seem like necessities, like guns, which made hunting a whole lot easier. And then after a while, people couldn't imagine hunting without them. This led to more competition among the various Indian groups, but also the political involvements that they had with the Spanish and the French and later the English and eventually the Americans that sort of led the native peoples to be involved in the wars of those European powers. Remember how we talked about the gun trade? All these various European powers were trading guns to the Indians and encouraging them to raid and kill the other European groups, right? Well, before contact, there were two kinds of battles on the plains. One was the more organized type of battle, where you had groups of warriors from two different sides, two different tribes or villages or whatever, and they would come together on one of these plains, usually a flat area, and they'd have one group over here and one group over there. And a lot of this was designed to create opportunities for for men, to show their courage and to win battlefield honors. That was the main focus, was you had to prove your abilities as a warrior. And that didn't necessarily translate into proving it by how many people that you killed. So without horses, what they would do is these two groups would come together. All the men on each side would have these big shields, and they would set the shields up, shields made of cedar wood, because it was light and easy to carry, but it was also a good protection against arrows. And so you'd have these two groups of guys lined up with their shields in front of them, and then behind them there would be archers that would fire arrows at the other group. But everyone's got their shields, right? There weren't many casualties. A lot of times maybe an individual would run out in front of the shields and taunt the other side, dare them to shoot him. Sometimes they did. But those types of acts of bravery were the biggest point of what they were doing. So this didn't usually result in a lot of casualties. Later on, when there were horses and people were a lot more mobile and could move more quickly, that changed, and probably the number of casualties in these conflicts picked up considerably. But that's one kind. The other kind is what happened at Crow Creek. One large group of warriors just overwhelming a smaller group, usually when they're at camp or when they're in their small village, just overwhelming them and usually killing all of them. This was not usually motivated by the desire to taunt the enemy and show how brave you were. This was usually something that was more likely to happen, like I said, when survival was at stake because resources were limited. So, when there were groups off at war like this on the plains, one thing that the war parties often would do is when they would make camp, they would make very impromptu sort of shelters when they were camping. War lodges, they were called. More like a it kind of looks like a teepee, but there's no hides around it. This is really mobile. You just find a bunch of sticks, basically, and stack them together in such a way you have a place to sleep out of the rain till you get up in the morning and go look for people to taunt and or kill. Now, some other things that were very specific to the plains cultures included staking oneself out. We'll talk about that in a moment, and counting coup. Even after horses were mastered, this was how most of those impromptu battles were carried out. European observers were kind of amazed by this. That guy on the horse there on the left, he has this long. That's not a spear. He has. It doesn't have a spear tip. It's not a weapon even really. It's called a coup stick. Now, coup, C-O-U-P. You can tell that's a French word because you don't pronounce half the syllables. The French, by the way, have a word spelled E-A-U-X, and it's pronounced O. So anyway, a lot of French influence in the Northern Plains. Coup is French for to strike or a blow or to hit. So the goal here was to win honor in battle, not by how many people you killed, not by how many scalps that you took, although those things did count. But what really counted more than those things was how many times you counted coup. And what that means is how many times you touched an armed opponent without killing them. Because that requires a great amount of bravery to run up or ride up to an armed enemy who's trying to kill you and try to touch them. You touch them with the coup stick, you're able to do it from a little bit more of a distance. If you can touch them with your bare hand, that's even better. That's how brave you are. And the more times you do that, the more honors accrue to you. And frequently they'd rush up, touch somebody, and then ride off real quickly, which is not to say that no one ever got hurt or killed. They did. And it's not to say they weren't trying to kill each other if they could. But this was the main goal, to demonstrate your bravery. Now, staking out, that is where an individual decides that they're going to make their final stand. And so they literally take a stake, a sharp piece of wood, and pound it into the ground with a sash, a long sash, tied to it and tied to their own leg. The idea being, I am going to hold this piece of ground and I will not retreat, and I will keep fighting until I die. This image, which is kind of blurry, it's the best screen capture I could get from the television miniseries Centennial from back in the 1970s, based on a novel by James Michener, which I usually assign in my environmental history class. One of the main characters in the first part of the book, Lame Beaver, he's getting old, and his dignity and pride are not going to allow him to have all of his teeth fall out. So he decides to go out in a blaze of glory and stakes himself out against his enemies. He was, in this story, this character was Arapaho. So when that happens, I mean, a lot of people are probably going to count coup on him. By the way, there's sort of an order in this counting coup. The first person to touch an enemy gets the highest honors. And then the second and third person, they get to count some honor too. So people would probably count coup on someone doing this, but eventually somebody would kill them. And that was very much a Plains Indian tradition. Now, I want to take a quick look at some weapons. We've talked about bows and arrows for quite a while, and you know what those are. But I wanted you to see this particular type of bow that was used by the Shoshones, who, again, we talked about this before, they dominated the northern plains for a while, for a couple of generations, because they had horses before any of the other people did on the plains. And they actually came down out of the mountains. So they had a tradition of not only hunting buffalo, but of hunting bighorn mountain sheep. And they would make their bows, these short bows, out of the really long horns of some of these mountain sheep. And they would add sinews and various other things to give it more snap. These bows were incredibly powerful, much more powerful than something that was made solely from wood. It has some really, really good striking power, and I thought that was a cool thing that a lot of folks don't know. And then here on the lower right is a Shoshone war club. War clubs were used by all tribes. It's not so. It doesn't have a blade. It's just like sharp rock on the end of a stick, and you can imagine swung with enough force, just how much damage one of those things could do. Okay, the last thing that I want to talk about pertaining to Plains culture is sign language. There was a system, a very effective system of sign language developed on the plains that spread throughout much of the west of the Mississippi River and most of Canada. That was universal. So all these different tribes who spoke different languages, and in some cases languages not even remotely related to one another, could communicate with each other for trade and diplomacy by the use of this system of sign language that developed. Now you can see on the map that form of sign language was used in the area that's in sort of that dark red maroon color, and you can see that's a large area. There were other sign language systems that developed. The yellow blotch there in the upper left on the map, that's the Columbian Plateau region. 4 or 5 tribes that lived there had a sign language that they could use with one another, but the Blackfeet Indians who lived near them, but also were on the plains, introduced Plains Sign Language, and the other one died out because they conformed to everybody else. As you can see, there were a small number of sign language systems way up in the northeast. But this is you see this in old movies too, and it's accurate. This is accurate. The various words for the different tribes and to describe different actions. It was very basic and fundamental, but it worked. So that is where I will stop so far as the discussion of Plains culture. And what we're going to do next, after we have introduced Europeans, guns, and horses, is we're going to introduce the United States of America onto the Great Plains.